I'm here with Jessi Johnson, and today we're going to get into a topic that I think is extremely relevant right now and for the future as we know it. You're a professor at USC.
Yes. So today is actually Blackout Tuesday. So it was started by music companies, and the idea behind it is that it's a day of silencing entertainment companies, and it kind of snowballed into companies in general, silencing their voices so that Black voices can be heard more clearly. And then that snowballed even more into generally non-Black voices just taking today to listen to Black voices and to amplify Black voices. And while they're just listening and while they're kind of taking a step back, using the opportunity to learn more about the Black American experience and to educate themselves on current movements like Black Lives Matter. I think when it comes to companies listening, it really starts with companies learning and companies learning the context of the movements. And so it's easy to say, like, well, just listen. But if you're just listening and you're not intaking anything and you're not learning when it comes to a company and not just a person, the company really needs to step back and learn about the current movement, but also why the current movement is important. So that's a big thing when it comes to companies and social movements. It's about you have the opportunity to establish your values and in a more practical way to establish your brand and establish your market base as well. But when it comes to establishing your values, it's how are you going to take a stand? How do you want your people to see you? How do you want even your non-customers to see you? Or do you want to be voiceless? And do you want to be silent on things? Because even silence is saying something. So what values do you have?
One of the realities about definitely marketers, branders, people that are content creators, they're always looking for a way to create content that's kind of relevant for modern day. And I think, with that right now comes a potential inherent lack of sensitivity.
Sure.
And it's definitely something I've been thinking about, because, when you start to quote unquote jump on the bandwagon and start to create content around a topic that maybe you're not necessarily apprised too much about, or you don't know too much about, or it's not something that you've ever explored, it might come off as disingenuous.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's a reality that we all need to deal with. And I think that what we're all trying to figure out is how I know I'm doing this personally is how I can just evolve. I can evolve during this process and understand what our new world looks like, our brave new world looks like. So what is your take on that in terms of how companies can be more sensitive, how they can kind of figure out how to way to not be on the sidelines, not be silent, but at the same time, not come off as disingenuous.
So when it comes to something like the Black Lives Matter movement, that's really being at the forefront of the media, even though it's been around since at least 2013. It's about amplifying the voices of the leaders of that movement and amplifying the voices of the people affected by that movement and who are working for change and who the change is working for as well. So when it comes to a company being sensitive, it's about pushing forward or amplifying those voices rather than the company speaking out and saying, this is what the movement is about. This is what we know. This is how we feel. It's like, well, let's actually step back as a company and amplify the educated voices about the movement, the leaders of the movement. In this case, the Black Lives Matter movement has 3 co-founders who are all Black women, amplifying what they say, amplifying what they educate about. And that's, to me, that's real sensitivity in not saying I as a company or we as a company know everything about this, so we're going to make a statement about it. It's like, we're going to put forward the people who know about this, we're going to give them a space and we're going to let them educate. And that's how you can be sensitive.
Even this kind of forum that we've created here is kind of it's a unique opportunity for us to do a lot of things at the same time. It's to listen, to learn. It makes it very easy for us, I think, to do this. But most companies don't necessarily have that setup, that arrangement per se. Mm-hmm. What would you say are some, you as a writer, what are some ways that we can go to the power of the pen to amplify voices?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can do some really amazing interviewing, a profile of somebody, and you bring in their perspective. You could make that the front page of your website, or you can at least make a link on your website about learn more about the current movement, and in that way amplify voices and not just make it about what your company thinks, but make it about the current context of the movement to show that you're there to actually learn and you're hopefully there to let others educate and not just let the company educate. So doing profile pieces is great. Even making short videos where you can interview other people, kind of like what we're doing right now, are all great ways. Even like making little ebooks that you can have your consumers, your customers, your clients download, so that they are taking the initiative themselves to learn more just by clicking that download button.
You have a very unique perspective because you're a professor at USC.
Yes.
And I think to your earlier point, we have one of the most altruistic young generations that is really focused on affecting change, and there are people out there that are fearless, and they are truly the ones that are on the front lines for us in terms of expression and protest and just being heard, generally speaking. What would you say your perspective is, in working with young people right now, and what are some of the trends that you're noticing? And I think most importantly, what is it that we can learn from young voices, from these fearless people?
I think education, so within a college or university institution, what I'm seeing a lot of is the institutionalized racism and institutionalized white supremacy. So that is part of the education system. So these institutions, these places of higher learning, were created literally on the premise of domination, on the premise of supremacy, on the purpose of uplifting some voices and downplaying other voices, or oppressing other voices, I should say. So those foundations haven't changed in hundreds of years. And even some of the things that we teach in higher education haven't changed. So the idea that you have to write and speak a very certain way in order to get an A in your English class. Well, who established that way of writing? And who said this is the only way to get an A is if you sound like this and write like this? Who are we sounding like and who are we writing like? So those standards that have a foundation in supremacy. And that's really dangerous because we're still teaching that to young people. So as an educator, and a lot of people in my field and also fellow educators are really trying to point out that institutionalized racism, that institutionalized supremacy, and saying like, yes, we want you to succeed. And yes, unfortunately, there are standards, but you are the people that are going to change. What we teach is what will continue. So if we start to teach that you don't have to adhere to the systemic racism, we can change that, then that is what will go out into the world with these younger people. And we're seeing a lot of that already. So a lot of younger people are moving to the world, understanding that the standards are based in supremacy, taking into the world is what will continue. And so they want to continue something else. When it comes to corporate America, and this is me speaking as an educator, but also someone with some experience in corporate America as well. There are also standards in corporate America, and it's about really being honest about where those standards came from, who created those standards, and who those standards are designed to support and uplift, and who they're designed to oppress. And if you're going to keep adhering to those standards, and that's going to make you uncomfortable, just as a human being, admitting where those standards come from, admitting who they're there to support and who they're there to not support, especially because we live in a society of a meritocracy, right? If anyone can make it if they try, anyone can make it if they work hard enough. Wherever you end up is because of all your own effort. But those structures that you're working inside of were built for very specific groups, and it was built to lift them up and support them, including the corporate world. So people end up rationalizing inequalities because they think they've ended up where they are because they worked hard, which is very true. But it's also true that certain groups worked hard and we're giving extra lift. So as a corporation, as a company, it's about being honest about where those standards came from, where those institutions came from, and if you're going to continue the standards of corporate America, or if you're going to try and change them so that other groups have equity and equitable opportunities.
What would you say some sort of actionable ways that we can help people and to amplify their voices, with respect to pain and with respect to strife and struggle and things that we're not necessarily comfortable talking about, either in education or academia or corporate. There are some topics that we just don't bring up. Whether it's racism, whether it's mental health, whether it's addiction, whether it's abuse. These are topics that are just taboo. Sharing things like that, sharing struggle like that is vulnerability, and there's a little bit of a a paradox there, because if we're trying to climb the corporate ladder, in air quotes, and go through that journey, that the last thing that we want to do, or at least that we've been taught to believe, is that the last thing that we need is vulnerability, where in fact I think it's the opposite. I think it's the vulnerability that really allows us to progress and evolve and to be connected with people.
It is uncomfortable and it is vulnerable and it's painful sometimes to think about these things and even admit these things, admit how we're part of them, admit how I'm part of them. And I beg you to sit in that. Like, don't run away from that discomfort. Don't run away from being uncomfortable, because the more we pretend that these things aren't supposed to be talked about, the less room we leave for justice and change. So if you're a company that really talks about, I stand for this value and I stand for justice and I stand for change and I stand for perhaps Black Lives Matter, if you're not going to sit in your discomfort, justice isn't going to happen, because you're just going to keep pretending that everything's okay if you never get uncomfortable. Because facing these specific truths about supremacy and domination and violence are very uncomfortable.
When there's a group of individuals, it could be a company, it could be a nonprofit, it could be just a team of some sort. How can we create more safe environments for people to be able to express themselves?
That's a really good question. And it's a really hard question, because sometimes as much as you do to create a safe space, people aren't going to feel safe. So I think the first thing, in my opinion, that you have to do is decide whom the safe space is for. You just can't create one space where inside of it everyone is equal and everyone is equally safe, because the kind of safety that each person needs or each group needs is going to be completely different. So in each individual space, you have to decide which individuals it's for. So let's say you want to create a safe space for Black women, and Black women specifically. First of all, does that include safety for Black disabled women? Is that the same type of safety for Black transgender women? It's all very intersectional. It's about creating individual spaces, understanding that you might not be welcome in there, even though you helped create it, about bringing in leaders from those communities into the spaces to do the leading instead of you. That's my opinion.
And I think, the beauty of this is that, with this type of a forum, and with this type of healthy exchange of information, this rhetoric can turn into new values, new corporate values. I think that's what we kind of set out to discuss in this. And I think that it's difficult to just say, hey, listen, we're going to take the next 72 hours and figure out what our mission statement is and what our corporate values are, because by doing that, I think you're sort of failing in the fact that you're not listening. You're not listening to the community, you're not listening to the public voices, but then you're also not listening to the cohorts, the stakeholders within your specific organization. And I think that evolution and that iteration of corporate values is the healthiest thing, because I think there's layers to it. And I think it all comes down to vulnerability and people's comfort to truly express themselves. Because if we create a forum and we say, what are things on your mind? What are our corporate values? Where can we align ourselves on? If we ask that today, the answer today might be different from what it is, a week from now, based on current events and based on what we're feeling personally, emotionally. So I think that evolution process is really important. I think it's really important to just have check-ins. It's one of the things that I realized that within our organization, I personally want to do a better job of that, to do check-ins and to understand what's the state of the union, what is happening, how can we do a better job to amplify voices, create safe environments, so on and so forth. So it's very inspirational what you're saying. There's a lot of hashtags that are being thrown around right now. And I want to really make sure I understand them, make sure that people understand them, just to kind of give them that respect. So, one of them is just listen.
The group that you're trying to be an ally for, allowing that group to do the speaking, to voice their opinions, to voice their grief, to voice their heartache, to voice their troubles. And you as an ally, literally just listen. You don't have to include your opinion. You don't have to say, well, I think this. Well, what about this? You don't have to ask your questions. You're not trying to get education from them. You're just listening and using the opportunity for self-reflection and processing without putting the burden of education on your group.
There's another hashtag. There's actually these two: say his name, say her name.
Absolutely.
Could you speak to those?
Absolutely. George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor. Say her name, say his name. There are unfortunately thousands of names to say, but it's about completely remembering and acknowledging and using their names as an action to bring to light the violence against the Black community and to not forget them and not let them just be yesterday's news or flash in the pan, but instead to always bring to mind the tragedy and the atrocity that happened to them and continually happens specifically to the Black American community and to Black and Brown people in America from these systemic institutionalized industries and police force and education. Say her name, say his name, don't forget, keep going. That's what it's speaking into.
I really want to thank you for your time. Any sort of closing thoughts, last words of inspiration here for us?
To the current movement and the current protests, it is not your place to say how people should express or fight against their oppression. It's your place to listen and where they're coming from and listen to the leaders and to the people being affected about how you can best be an ally instead of just saying, I already know how to be an ally. Really listen and really learn. And Blackout Tuesday is a great way to start with that.
Thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely.
And you're a powerful voice.
Thank you.